Brought to you by Lean Body, the #1 protein shake in gyms across America.
Hey guys, Lee Labrada here coming at you from the Labrada Nutrition Gym in Houston, and today I have a very special guest. His name is Ben Yannis, and he is an expert on teaching people exercise mechanics. Today we are going to be looking at the mechanics of proper execution of tricep exercises and how you can avoid the most common injuries surrounding that joint. So if you've ever suffered from any elbow pain doing tricep exercises, this video is for you. Ben, welcome.
Thanks, Lee. Pleasure to be here. So we're going to go over two main segments, one with free weights and one with cables. And we're going to start out by going over the traditional straight bar skull crusher, which isn't necessarily a bad option, but it is an option that a lot of people tend to get elbow boo-boos with. All right, so we're going to really optimize the setup. We're going to discuss the potential problems with this movement, and then we're also going to talk about some dumbbell and cable alternatives after that.
All right, so shall we start with the first one?
Let's do it. All right, so the first exercise we're gonna go over is the traditional straight bar skull crusher.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get on this bench here and get into position. All right.
So Lee's just gonna go through a couple reps here.
Okay.
And we'll kind of talk about just the execution. Is that how you sort of normally do them? I know.
That's right.
Yeah, so bar to forehead.
This is how I normally do it. I just bring the bar slowly down to the forehead, try to keep the elbows pointed straight up.
Yep, yep.
You know, and sometimes it agitates that tricep tendon on the back side of the arm.
Right. Something that's going to be really important to sort of recognize is that, much like Lee was just saying, is he's going to kind of really work to force his elbows that way. And the reason that he's got to try to force himself to do that is because this is a free weight, which means that it's basically just as per the name of the motion, it's trying to crush his skull, right? And so what that means is that if our forearms and our upper arms are not sort of aligned with that resistance, parallel to that resistance, it might be a little bit difficult for him to actually manage that from the perspective of the elbow, because the elbow is a hinge joint. It only moves in one direction. So unlike the shoulder, it's not going to be able to rotate particularly well. So a really cool sort of way to think about this is if I take this bar from Lee's hand, Lee, just for me, do that same exact motion now, just without the bar.
Okay.
So what you'll notice is that naturally, without any weight, watch kind of what happens to the direction of Lee's elbows, right? They kind of almost want to point outward. So if you weren't kind of forcing your elbows in this position, you might say that you would be a little bit more comfortable maybe to sort of move inward and outward, right? And so what happens at this point is the hands, what you'll notice is they come down to the forehead, but then they extend outward over the shoulders. But when you fix your hands to this kind of a bar, right, this resistance isn't actually able to traverse in the direction that his forearms are moving. So a better alternative as compared to the fixed bar motion might be dumbbells. Again, if you're comfortable with the fixed bar, nothing wrong with that. But if you have a little bit of discomfort there, a step in the right direction might be to choose dumbbells. So Lee's just basically gonna go through what is a little bit more comfortable for him. And already what you can notice is he's able to actually bring the weights to a place where not only does he actually get more range of motion at the elbow, potentially a little bit more stimulus for the triceps, but he's also able to take them a little bit more freely wherever he wants to. And so again, what that might allow him to do is to load his elbow in a direction that it's more comfortable moving.
You know, that really stretched position at the bottom is so important. You know, all the research is showing that there's a lot of growth that comes, you know, from resistance under stretching.
Yeah, absolutely. So if Lee comes down to that position, because he has his arm in this position, like he said, he can load that stretch position. A lot of guys, however, will pull their arms way overhead, and they'll get to the point where now the hand is actually sitting directly underneath the elbow. So although you're kind of stretching your shoulder in this particular case, like lats, maybe some pecs in there, right? The dumbbell being underneath of the elbow actually means that the stretch is unloaded, which may feel a little bit better on the elbows, but in terms of the tricep stimulus, might not be ideal. So again, that's a great point, which is that bringing the elbows just a little bit forward will actually allow you to load that bottom end of the range as compared to dropping them all the way back here.
That's an excellent point, Ben.
Thanks.
Seriously, that was really good. I like that.
All right, so if the 2-arm dumbbell doesn't feel great for you, here's another version of this exercise that may be the most sort of liberating for your elbow, again, if you have those elbow boo-boos going on. So I really want you to notice sort of the crook of Lee's elbow here, and notice that it's actually facing sort of this way, right? It's not sort of pointed backward in this direction. And so where his elbow might actually naturally fall is kind of like across his face. And because he has a single dumbbell instead of two, he can actually allow his hand to come across his face this way. Now, if that's a little bit not too comfortable on your shoulder, what you can do is simply use your other hand, press it up against your biceps, almost like a brace for your upper arm. And what you can do is allow that dumbbell to come across your face so that you can not only load that stretch position, look at all this distance here in the bottom position, but you can also really individualize the motion so that it's comfortable for your elbow. Something else to potentially experiment around with is just if you were to sort of come to that top of the motion, Lee, and let your arm actually lean this way. There you go. So now if you lower the dumbbell, see how you're able to get a little bit of extra range there, sort of on the other side of the neck?
Yeah, feel more tension on it as well.
Exactly.
Good.
And as long as you got that hand there, you can kind of support this shoulder if the shoulder ends up being any kind of problem in this motion. The last thing that I'll point out, and if we can show the other arm now, just to sort of get another angle here. Again, same sort of a thing. And the great thing about the single arm version is that if there are differences between sides, and a lot of people have differences between sides, which is totally fine, you can really just adjust and sort of optimize for either side on its own. And then in addition to that, because you're using a dumbbell, you can also play around with the position of your hand and your forearm to see sort of whatever is more comfortable for you. So Lee can kind of just experiment around with, does a twisting thing feel better? Does it feel better to have my palm toward my face? Does it feel better to have my palm sort of more in a neutral position, right where the back of the hand is facing the ceiling? Whatever it happens to be, don't assume that there's one right answer, and be willing to sort of experiment around with which of these options feels best for you. All right, so what we just talked about with the free weights, all that stuff is going to apply here as well. So just to sort of like look at Lee's elbows and where they naturally want to move, can you just sort of stand like you normally stand, maybe face the camera?
Yep.
And just pretend like you're doing a curl.
Okay, so curl?
Yeah, just a curl. You sort of naturally see that, his hands come upward and downward, but now like pretend you're going to do a triceps extension. What do you do instead? Yep. So notice what happens when he does that, right? So notice that his hands come inward, sort of more toward his sternum, and then toward the bottom, they naturally actually want to come outward. And so much like the skull crusher that we talked about, where, if you fix your hands to an implement, you have to kind of move them in that same direction, something like this kind of a bar is going to restrict you in somewhat of a similar way. So it's not going to necessarily be bad for everyone, but if you have some elbow discomfort, that freedom of motion to move in and out is going to be helpful. So if we just do a couple reps here with this fixed bar and kind of just think about the same things. Again, what you'll notice is Lee kind of just naturally has to tuck his arms in, sort of squeeze his arms into his body. And a really good landmark to focus on when you're looking at like where does the elbow move is this bony prominence here. It's called the olecranon, and basically what it dictates is where this hand is going to have to move. So notice that it's not really straight pointed backward this way, it's actually angled outward like this. So if we're going to really optimize for loading the elbow in a careful way and in a way that might be more pain-free, more comfortable, we want to kind of load at a little bit of a diagonal angle instead of in a way where we're forced to sort of keep our hands inward toward our body this way.
Ben, do you find that working with a rope where you can actually move, you have greater degrees of freedom, do you find that that's helpful for your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So a rope is kind of a step sort of in the direction of more freedom. But with more freedom comes other potential problems, right? So, maybe this is more comfortable from the perspective of you feel like you can just the raw power of it is a little bit, easier. It's easier to push into a fixed bar. It's a little bit harder for people to manage that freedom. Some people start to wiggle around, do weird things with their shoulders. So the upside of that is, more freedom of the hands. The downside might be just pushing might be a little bit harder for people.
So let's talk about that, because you just jogged the thought, and that is that sometimes I've seen people like myself that will keep the elbows locked on the side and will keep their upper body straight, and they will push it. It's almost like they're hinging at the elbow, right? Then I've seen others that will almost do this kind of motion.
Yeah, like a J.
Okay, yeah, almost like they're pumping a pump, trying to fill up a bicycle tire.
Yes.
Let's talk about that for a second. What are your thoughts?
Oh, that's a great distinction to make. So I kind of lump those into two categories, like triceps overall.
Yeah.
There's the one category, which is the first one you described, which is sort of like the push down type motion where I'm keeping my shoulders still.
Right.
And then there's a second version, which is like, I'm going to do a triceps press, like you could do it with a fixed bar or a push down like this. So there's going to be a couple of distinctions between those two things. The main one is going to be that if you think about the anatomy of the triceps, right, there's the long head of the triceps, the one that sort of sits, if we can point on you.
Yep.
On the inner side here, and this one is going to cross the shoulder, which means that when it contracts, it's going to create force at the shoulder. But the other two heads, right, the lateral head, the medial head, those don't cross the shoulders. So much in the same way that, like, think about the quads, right, you would want to do a leg extension and also a squat motion.
Right.
In the same sort of sense, I think both triceps motions have their place because the single joint ones will be more involved in the pressing type of motion, which is oftentimes, people say they feel their outer head with this kind of a thing, and maybe their inner head with more of a stretch or something where their shoulder is still. So both of those things do slightly different, things in terms of what they stimulate. So I think each has their place, and I think each should probably be a part of a program, an overall sort of holistic approach.
Okay.
So if we're going to make an alteration to this, what we can do first is we can say, much like Lee talked about, is we can use something that's more like a rope. Now, many of you might not have this kind of attachment, but just think about this like a rope that's a little bit longer. And what you'll notice is that because of this freedom, because we're not restricted to any fixed thing, what Lee can do as he extends his elbows and as he contracts his triceps is he can bring his hands outward toward the sides. And some people might immediately find that to be a little bit more comfortable, but again, the downside might be that it's a little bit less stable, potentially a little bit harder to push into. But for you, I think it's probably going to be really, really great to have that extra.
Yeah, I actually like it.
Yeah.
You get a great contraction with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you do if this kind of a thing is like, it still doesn't feel perfect, little bit of wonkiness? Well, what we can do instead is we could just take a normal D handle or anything similar, but for now, just because it's here, we have a little bit of a cuff. But if you have a D handle, just a regular handle, you can use that as well. And what Lee's going to do is he's going to grab this with a single arm. So I'm just going to put this right here. Yep, and he's just going to loop that around his wrist. And so what I personally recommend, just as a starting point, is to really get this part of the wrap as close to this wrist joint as possible. So let's scoot that just a little bit closer, yeah. So you don't really have to worry too much about your hand, right? You can really just focus on everything that's going on here. And notice that when Lee naturally set up here, he set up in a way where he was almost sort of turning into his arm, right? And that's so that he can optimize for that elbow path inward and outward. So if you just go through a couple reps here, notice that this cable is coming across his body, rather than sort of straight upward and downward where he has to really force that shoulder position. And again, the great thing about this is that if this doesn't feel perfect, you can simply just turn your torso, you can change the position of your hand, you can move closer or farther away. All those different things are things to play around with, again, just to feel what is best for you from a comfort perspective. Now, one more thing that I'll say is, much like we talked about in the dumbbell variation, sort of making sure we load the stretch position, I just want to demonstrate two extremes here. So Lee, if you step back away from the cable, yeah, just like at the extreme, notice that like this is the line of force, right? So it's basically just going right through your elbow. It's really just a shoulder thing at this point. It's almost like you're doing like a row, right? So if you go to the bottom of the extension, feel how hard that is at the bottom. It's like really hard in that position, which might have some application. But if you step really close, so let's say you step all the way over here, now you're really, really on top of the cable, right? So now it's vertical, here's that distance.
Yep.
And as you extend, it's gonna get a little bit easier at the bottom, but much harder in the stretch, right?
Yeah, that's
so you can use more load in this variation just because you're matching the resistance to the strength of this a little bit better, or a little bit more appropriately, I'll say.
Right. So the relative position of your body relative to the machine is important.
Exactly.
Yeah, and can actually shift the part of the force curve that the tricep.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right. And one other sort of thing to mention is, even if you do, a lot of people will say something like, well, if you move closer, then it will be heavier in the stretch. But what if you move closer here and instead you just allow your arm to come over here? You're closer, but now look at that force, right? So now all of a sudden you're just doing a pull down again.
I like that. What we're doing is we're thinking about the angles and the force curve, you know, basically where the tricep meets the most resistance.
Yep, exactly. And that's going to be important just from a stimulus perspective because, and this is something I like to say, is more length equals more strength. So you're generally in more lengthened stretch positions, you're going to be a little bit stronger, a little bit better force producing capability, which for hypertrophy strength can be great. But if you're working around an injury, let's say you're trying to heal
glad that you brought that up.
Right?
Yeah.
That might not be the best thing, right? Like more is kind of more. More stress is more stress.
Right.
So if we want to load the elbow in a way where, you know, maybe we're reintroducing some load, we don't want to just go right into things and just sort of do as much as we can. We can actually use that sort of step back strategy as a way to start to just load the contracted position. And then over time, as maybe we get a pump, maybe we start to feel a little bit better, we grease the groove, then we can maybe step forward and start to load that stretch position a little bit more. So that's kind of how I like to grade the exposure of stress for some people with elbow forearm stuff, and just using that ability to, you know, a cable is just so versatile. You can do so many things with it, set your body up in so many ways, and that's just one of the many, in addition to the others we
So
talked
Ben,
about.
for people that have developed, you know, issues with the elbows, I mean, their elbows hurt or the tricep tendon hurts, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, so generally speaking, I would say start with the assumption that more freedom of motion is just going to be a better overall sort of approach, right? So
Maybe just kind of finding the right angle.
Yeah. And in tandem with that, I find that nowadays a lot of people, and it's great to some degree, they get a lot of information and they start to think that there are hard rules. So they'll say, oh, if I'm training triceps, I can only do this thing, or I have to load the stretch, right? That's a good example, a more recent popular example. But I think that just sort of stepping outside of those frameworks, those assumptions, and starting to think more from the perspective of how can I just load this thing in a way that feels good, right? It's kind of like we're just returning to the most simple thing. So anything that allows for this kind of freedom, anything that just tilts you in the direction of being able to load more of that squeeze position first, I think is generally a good approach. And then anything in addition to that that allows you to actually turn this forearm segment, I think has a large impact on the elbow. And just for those who might be curious, your elbow is really a complex. It's not just one thing. So there's like pain that happens kind of in here and then pain that happens kind of more out here. Oftentimes the pain that's more in here is more of like an elbow thing, and then the pain that happens over here is more of a forearm thing.
Right.
So if you're feeling more of the pain on the outside, it might be a good idea to play around with this stuff more. More on the inside, maybe more pay attention to the angles and all the things that we just went over.
All right, guys, so that does it for our tricep session today with Ben Yanis. Ben, thank you so much. This was very, very informative, and I know that our viewers will be able to take away a lot of great ideas for their own tricep training.
Well, thanks, Lee. Thanks for having me.